This is a lesson on environmental racism where people of color face systemic neglect and harmful environmental practices that negatively impact their health and future. Racially based policies have funneled toxic waste, polluted air, and contaminated water into communities already burdened by economic and social disparities. These injustices are not mere accidents, but deliberate outcomes of a system that values profit over the lives of racial minorities. This video confronts these realities, demanding urgent action for environmental justice and the reclamation of our right to a healthy, dignified life. I was born and raised in South Los Angeles. My parents immigrated from Mexico 20 years ago in the hopes of a better life, and together we've had to work multiple low wage and exploitative jobs to survive the economy in Los Angeles. Living in South LA, I've moved around with my family to areas like Inglewood, Southgate, Compton, Linwood, and Watts due to not being able to afford increasing rent, evictions, and economic instability. I'm currently heading to a long shift at my warehouse job, and I'm exhausted because I didn't get much sleep last night. I live right next to a freeway, and the constant sounds of highway traffic, police sirens, and cars honking kept me up all night. It doesn't help that in my public housing unit, the walls are thin and there's poor insulation, so I can hear everything my neighbors are doing in this overcrowded place.
I was born and raised in Palos Verdes Estates, but today I live in Beverly Hills. Other than our Beverly Hills home, my family owns 3 other properties located in Hidden Hills, San Francisco, and New York. My parents are the CEOs of a multi-million-dollar company, and I have been lucky to inherit their business skills and use them for my own company. It's a beautiful day today, and I'm getting ready to go for a walk in my neighborhood before I head to a big business meeting at my company. It was a quiet night as usual, and I got a great 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. I can always bet on having stable and peaceful nights. As long as I lived here, strict zoning laws have prohibited any commercial or industrial activities near my home. And if a business or construction site is too loud, me and other residents can file complaints. Local officials and the homeowners association always take us seriously.
On my way to work, I pass by the same industrial plants and waste incinerators every day. I know I'm not alone because my friends in East LA and in the Harbor LA area complain about the landfills, Superfund sites, and chemical plants they live near as well. The air in my area is almost always stale and heavy, and it smells of exhaust, burnt chemicals, garbage, rotting waste, and industrial emissions. Sometimes I wish that we had more trees and green spaces. My neighborhood has few parks, and the ones we do have are small, have poorly maintained playgrounds, cracked sidewalks, and are unsafe.
On my walk, I'm admiring my neighborhood because it has the best walking trails lined with large and mature trees. Our local governments invest heavily into our parks, leaving me and my neighborhood with well-maintained nature reserves, hiking trails, fountains, lakes, and sports fields. The birds chirping, wind in the trees, the clean air with no dust, smog, or harmful emissions make my walks all the more enjoyable. I'm glad these high pollution industries are located far, far away from me.
I'm finally at work, and although I'm tired, I'm just grateful for the clean water I have today, which I know is not always the case. My access to clean water is inconsistent as I've experienced frequent boil water advisories, which requires me to boil tap water for safety and before drinking or cooking. Even without a boil advisory, I avoid drinking tap water because of its possible discoloration and past lead contamination scares. Additionally, my public housing unit has old pipes, so even when my municipal water is clean, lead or rust from the pipes can contaminate it before reaching the tap. My water sometimes smells strange and has an unusual taste, so today I'm grateful just to have water.
After my walk, I came home to a glass of filtered, clean water straight from my tap. This water is refreshing, clear, odor-free, and tastes fresh. I have a built-in filtration system, a new plumbing system, and water softeners, making my water quality spectacular. In the highly unlikely occurrence of a boil water advisory, the government response would be immediate and get our water back to a safe condition quickly.
After work, I plan to go grocery shopping, but I live in a food desert, which means I have limited access to affordable and nutritious food. The nearest full service grocery store is miles away, which means I have to take multiple buses to get there. In my neighborhood, I see more corner stores, liquor stores, dollar stores, and fast food chains than supermarkets, and they mostly sell processed, unhealthy, and low quality foods such as frozen meals. Any fresh produce that is available is limited, overpriced, or wilted. Sometimes it's hard not to give in to the faster, easier, and more affordable option, but I don't always have enough money. McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, and KFC locations surround me, and a $4 burger over a $12 salad is all I can afford sometimes.
Before heading into work, I'm going to stop by a grocery store down the street to get freshly made green juices or a fruit smoothie. Ever since I moved into this neighborhood, I noticed that there are multiple well-stocked grocery stores and organic markets within a 5-minute drive from my home. We also have many farmers markets and farm-to-table restaurants, which means the food is locally grown. These stores are amazing. I can find a wide variety of fresh, organic, and high-quality food at competitive prices.
As is evident, the resident of South Los Angeles and the inhabitant of Beverly Hills lead two drastically different lives despite living less than 20 miles away from each other. These environmental disparities can arise out of numerous social, economic, and political reasons that are systematically and institutionally intertwined. For example, historic housing discrimination practices such as redlining, racially restrictive covenants, blockbusting, and racial steering all constitute what is known as systemic and institutional racism. In these practices, predominantly white people with power, such as real estate agents, landlords, businessmen, and government officials, implemented policies and practices that kept people of color out of white neighborhoods, deliberately segregated communities by race, and limited access to financial resources like loans. This enabled white communities to reap the benefits of home ownership in desirable areas, while people of color faced persistent obstacles to home ownership and were confined to low-income, neglected, and underfunded neighborhoods that coexisted with environmental waste. At the very core, these housing discrimination practices go hand in hand with environmental racism. Environmental racism is the unspoken truth that has turned shared geography into a map of segregated destinies, and it refers to any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, communities based on race or color. These policies and practices disproportionately lead communities of color to be exposed to environmental hazards such as toxic waste, air pollution, and industrial facilities. As such, people of color in the US are not afforded the same privileges of non-Hispanic white people. While white people typically have the educational, economic, political, and social power to gain authority over their environment, people of color are concentrated in poverty and have a lack of economic opportunity due to discriminatory obstacles. Thus, exclusionary and restrictive practices have limited participation by people of color in decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies that govern land use. In this sense, the more powerful white residents can make decisions about the use of undesirable land in ways that are beneficial to them. With this, the homes of marginalized communities quickly become sacrifice zones, which are populated areas with high levels of pollution and environmental hazards thanks to nearby toxic or polluting industrial facilities. These areas are called sacrifice zones because the health and safety of people in these communities are placed under a low priority, inferior, and subordinate bracket as they are being effectively sacrificed for the economic gains and prosperity of more affluent or politically influential white groups. The effects of environmental racism are not always visible, as is the case with noise pollution. Studies have consistently shown that communities of color in the United States are disproportionately affected by noise pollution compared to white communities. This occurs because the homes of people of color are typically placed near major roadways, freeways, airports, and industrial facilities, which results in higher levels of ambient noise from traffic, construction, aviation, and industrial activities. Thus, people of color experience about 7 decibels greater, which is 2 times louder, of excess transportation noise exposures than white people nationwide, which is a pattern consistent across U.S. counties. Additionally, Hispanic populations were 1.69 times more likely to be highly annoyed by aviation noise, and non-Hispanic Black populations were 1.48 times more likely to be highly annoyed by railway noise than white populations. Noise pollution has harmful and detrimental psychological and physical health effects. It can lead to stress, fatigue, depression, anxiety, hysteria, respiratory agitation, racing pulse, high blood pressure, headaches, and a loss of focus. When it comes to environmental racism and air quality, people of color suffer most from toxic air because of their close proximity to industrial emissions, vehicle exhaust, and power plant operations. In 96.6% of counties, Black Americans had the highest PM 2.5 mortality. PM 2.5, or fine particulate matter, is dangerous because of their small size. These particles can penetrate deep into the lungs and even enter the bloodstream, leading to inflammation, oxidative stress, and damage to organs. In 2016, the average PM 2.5 concentration for the Black population was 13.7% higher than that of the white population. Additionally, on average, people of color make up 56% of the population in neighborhoods with toxic release inventory facilities compared to 30% elsewhere. The health effects of poor air quality on communities of color are significant. One study found that communities of color in the United States experience 7.5 times higher pediatric asthma rates and 1.3 times higher premature mortality rates due to PM 2.5 and nitrogen dioxide pollutants compared with mostly white communities. Other health effects include lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and heart attacks and strokes. When it comes to environmental racism and green spaces, studies have found that about 9 times as many Latinx residents and 6 times as many Black residents live in lower income, park deficient areas than in higher income, park rich areas when compared to white residents. And even though Latinx residents comprise just under 50% of the county-wide population, they make up about 75% of the residents in lower income, park deficient census tracts, and only 15% of the population in higher income, park rich areas. Without parks and green spaces, residents are deprived of opportunities for physical exercise and relaxation, which can lead to higher rates of obesity, cardiovascular disease, and mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. Furthermore, urban areas lacking vegetation tend to experience poorer air quality and heightened urban heat island effects. The lack of communal green area also reduces opportunities for social interaction and community bonding, which contributes to a diminished quality of life and increased social isolation. Pertaining to environmental racism and access to clean water, studies have found that communities of color bear the worst impacts of failing water infrastructure in the U.S., which includes living in areas with high water contamination, storm and wastewater overflows, and increased flood risk. Other findings include, but are not limited to, the fact that in the United States, nearly 1 in 2 minority adults and 1 in 4 minority children do not drink tap water on any given day. Additionally, minority groups, such as Hispanics and non-whites, face 1.77% greater likelihood of water quality violations than white groups. In the US, water pollution has caused 1.8 million deaths in 2015. Other adverse health effects include diarrhea, cancer, chemical poisoning, Legionnaire's disease, and neurological damage. An example of inequitable access to clean water is the Flint water crisis. The Flint water crisis occurred in April 2014 in Flint, Michigan, where over 50% of the population are Black and over 40% are living in highly poor areas. This occurred when the city's drinking water source was switched from Detroit's system, which sourced from Lake Huron and the Detroit River, to the Flint River. This decision was made as a temporary cost-saving measure while a new pipeline to Lake Huron was being built. However, the Flint River's water was more coercive and contained high levels of chloride from road salt runoff, but officials failed to treat it with corrosion inhibitors. As a result, the water eroded the lead pipes, causing toxic levels of lead to contaminate the water supply. Lead leached into the drinking water from old lead pipes, exposing thousands of residents. Despite all of this, state officials, including the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, ignored complaints from residents who reported discolored, foul-smelling, and bad-tasting water. Additionally, officials dismissed early reports of lead contamination despite warnings from experts and doctors. If this crisis had occurred in a wealthier, wider city, it is unlikely officials would have ignored the problem for so long. 12 people died in the Flint water crisis from Legionnaire's disease outbreak, which is a severe form of pneumonia, and dozens became sick. Additionally, because lead is a neurotoxin, children were especially at risk for irreversible brain damage. E. coli bacteria was also detected, leading to periodic boil water advisories. It wasn't until September 2015 that independent researchers from Virginia Tech confirmed the dangerous levels of lead in the water. Multiple officials, including Michigan's governor and state health officials, faced criminal charges and lawsuits over their roles in the crisis. The federal government declared a state of emergency in January 2016 and allocated millions of dollars for relief efforts. Flint's water infrastructure is still being replaced, and the crisis remains a symbol of environmental injustice, systemic racism, and government neglect. Another example of environmental racism is the lack of access to healthy foods. Lack of access to healthy foods that support healthy dietary patterns may have a greater impact on members of racial or ethnic minority communities due to other social and environmental determinants they tend to face. For instance, most marginalized communities live in a food desert. Additionally, a food density study showed that neighborhoods with an 80% or greater proportion of African American residents had an average of 2.4 restaurants per mile compared to 1 restaurants per mile in neighborhoods with only 20% African American residents. Predominantly Black low-income neighborhoods also have an average travel time of 1.1 miles farther to the closest supermarket. Further, 20% of Black African American households were food insecure at some point in 2021, as were 16% of Hispanic or Latino households when compared to 7% of white households. The lack of access to healthy food can lead communities of color to be at greater risk for obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, malnutrition, and micronutrient deficiencies, and a weakened immune system. As is evident, due to its detrimental and life-threatening effects on marginalized communities of color, environmental racism must end. Environmental racism is violence. It poisons the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the land we live on. It is not an accident, it is a system. A system that places landfills next to Black neighborhoods, pipelines through indigenous lands, and toxic factories in working-class Latino communities. It is a system that says some lives are worth more than others. Ending environmental racism is not just about policy, it is about power. Most of the people with power to influence environmental policies, the ones benefiting from pollution, and the ones who have a voice that are taken seriously, are wealthy white people and corporations. Thus, environmental racism is a direct consequence of white supremacist systems that prioritize profit and the well being of wealthier, predominantly white communities over marginalized, often Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. In this sense, addressing environmental racism without confronting white supremacy would be addressing symptoms without actually targeting the root cause. This means redistributing power so that communities most affected by environmental harm control decisions about their own land, their health, and their future. It also means disrupting racial capitalism and centering people of color's voices in climate movements, policy discussions, and media coverage. Lastly, it also means enacting reparations for marginalized communities, such as investing in Black and Brown communities through clean energy, healthcare, and education. Ending environmental racism could also be reached through a variety of other means, such as strengthening and enforcing environmental regulation in people of color's communities. This could look like the Environmental Protection Agency enforcing laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act in marginalized communities. Additionally, prioritizing community-led solutions can look like local residents having the decision-making power in environmental policies affecting their neighborhoods or funding for grassroots groups. Further, strengthening political representation can mean supporting candidates who prioritize environmental justice policies or strengthening voting access for marginalized communities to influence environmental policies. Moreover, building coalitions and solidarity can mean linking environmental justice with labor or racial justice movements and using storytelling to raise awareness and shift public perception. In all, justice demands action, and action starts now, because clean air, safe water, and a livable planet are not privileges, they are rights.